Japan accounts for slightly over 50% of the total global supply of industrial robotics. So, as a side note, at the same time, these companies have fortress balance sheets. They have very high cash levels, low debt levels, very traditional Japanese companies that tend to be more conservative than Western companies. But that comment aside, I think you're seeing companies like Fanuc, SMC, Yaskawa, many others that are truly enabling automation around the world. And we know that the world is building more factories and requiring more automation, right? Especially if we think about the current geopolitical landscape and a lot of the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing around the world. We're seeing many companies bringing back that manufacturing capacity to their countries, whether that's the United States or Europe, or trying to, friendshoring, trying to bring those manufacturing capacities to countries where these countries have good relationships with. So I think that's where we're going to see a lot of capital going to. If you look at CapEx for the next 5 years or so, it's likely that CapEx on robotics and automation is going to account for about 25% of total capital spending between the next 5 years or so. So I think that's where these Japanese companies are going to truly benefit within the next few years.
Why Japan rather than another region?
Well, you're talking about companies that have been around for, 80, 90, 100 years in some cases, right? These are the companies that have really kickstarted the automation revolution back in the day. If you think about it, the two largest markets for robotics and automation until now have been car manufacturers, the auto industry, and also consumer electronics. So those have been the two largest markets. By default, you're definitely seeing a lot of car companies coming out of Japan. So they've been using those robotic solutions for many, many years. The consumer electronic markets as well, heavily positioned in Asia for the last several years. So I think Japan was strategically positioned to really accommodate the demand from those two markets. Let's not forget, Japan has great relationships with both, the Western world, countries like the United States, but also even with countries like China, right? So I think Japan is definitely very well positioned with that neutral, let's call it neutral, a geopolitical position around the world. And SMC is a good example of a company that, does provide a lot of services to these two industries, car companies and consumer electronics. And one other interesting study or research that we're trying to do is understanding the impact in automation as car companies transition from internal combustion engine cars to electric vehicles, right? And we've realized that robotics and automation capabilities can be much greater in electric vehicles relative to internal combustion engine cars. And the reason why is essentially because an electric vehicle has way less parts or moving parts than an internal combustion engine, right? So if you actually look at Tesla, for example, as a proxy, you can truly see that Tesla's robotic capabilities in their factories is much greater than any other car company. And I think that's a result of the electric vehicle a format that, again, like I said before, way less moving parts than an internal combustion engine car. So I think as every single car company in the world transitions towards electric vehicles, we would see a pickup in automation and factory build outs around the world, and potentially these Japanese companies that we're talking about today benefiting as a result of that.
Yeah, and before we move on, just to highlight another example of one of those interesting Japanese companies, Omron aren't a company that I'd heard too much about, but I saw their main product described as providing businesses with a nervous system. So perhaps you can briefly explain who they are and how that product works.
Yeah, much of what Omron is doing is, like you say, is making the brain, right, or the nervous system for these robotics and factory automation capabilities. So, if you think about it, most of those capabilities are actually surrounded by sensors. So, sensors are critical to factories to essentially make sense of everything that's happening and moving around the factory, right? So I think there are special technologies essentially allowing machines to talk to each other, share information, and work together, right? So essentially like a team. So I think that's really kind of what they refer as their nervous system, their brain behind their automation capabilities.